Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Research to Rescue. This will be Part 6, Chapter 6, entitled The Trolley Leaves When You Choose the Track, Kid, and we have a schedule to keep. Laying in bed, trying to sleep and miserably failing, Izuku came to the realization that his shoulder was fit to become a major problem if he didn't find someone with a healing quirk to fix it. It was mainly just uncomfortable and ached if he put too much pressure. Aches that were fading, but it was taking way too long. The burn crawled up part of his neck and covered his left shoulder, going all the way down the outside and front of his arm to his forearm. The burn was partially healed by a quirk and wrapped in bandages when he was passed out, just enough so the skin was repaired, scarred, but repaired, and he could still use it like any other limb, but it wasn't enough to keep it from aching every time he moved it. There had to be some sort of damage underneath that Hisashi neglected to have fixed, either out of carelessness or to set a reminder for Izuku. It'd either heal slowly or be permanent. Who could tell so early on? Yukio certainly didn't hold back, though she didn't seem to, and be in the mood to do anything worse than a few good kicks with a knife and a couple dozen bruises. He was lucky he only got away with what he did. Either way, it still hurt, but what was new? His body actively worked against him most of the time. Izuku's mind was wandering back to that conversation. A chill ran up his spine just remembering. Izuku went into the offices just as calmly as possible and was greeted by only Yukio, and before he knew it, he was downstairs in one of the many cells, tied to the metal chair by his wrist and left under starch-white light for an hour. It was nothing new for him, but now there was a metal table in front of him too, with Hisashi sitting in his own chair, completely unrestricted on the other side, hands working to put small photos across the surface one by one. When he was finished, he bridged his fingers on the table and leaned forward, giving Izuku one of its deceptive, bittersweet smiles that made him feel sick. It was hard not to stare at the photos before him. Izuku looked each one over, felt his stomach drop even more, and his heart rate go up. There were 5 altogether. They were freshly printed. They were recently taken. They were of Inko, and it seems that she didn't even know a camera was aimed her way. There was one of her walking outside the apartment, the same apartment she and Izuku used to live in together. One of her with a tall blonde guy in a grocery store. She was putting something in the basket he held and laughing. Laughing. One was of her talking to that guy again and walking down the street, camera at their backs. The cameraman was seemingly behind a bush or a plant. Another aimed at the window that Inko was opening. A bird was in one side of the frame at the top of a fence, maybe to justify taking the photo at that angle. The last one was Inko with Bakugo's mother. She didn't seem to change all that much since Izuku last saw her, but they were chatting and smiling at a small cafe on a street corner. Inko looked almost happy. She was living. She was alive and living and unhurt. She was alive because Izuku was doing as he was told. Izuku did something he shouldn't have. "You know," said Hisashi as Izuku stared at the final photo. "These were taken just yesterday. Quite a busy woman she is." Izuku didn't look up, and Hisashi sighed loudly. "Son, we had rules in place, right?" "I didn't break any rules," Izuku answered, and Hisashi's eyes flared up in a simmering anger that Izuku had to bite his tongue at. "No, you didn't. But I thought it was implied that you do what I tell you to do. Nothing more, nothing less. And your actions today, well." Hisashi put another photo on the table, this one closer to Izuku's side. It was a printed screenshot of a newscast, the frame frozen to show a figure in a gray hoodie, pulling someone back, hood fallen to show a mop of green hair, and a gloved hand pointed like a gun at a towering villain. To anyone else, this was a mystery kid, some brat who wanted to play hero, and did so dangerously. To anyone who knew that face, that pose, that attack, it was Rabbit, though not very many would immediately recognize him without the mask. Izuku paled. "Let me see if I have your actions down straight here," Hisashi pointed at the screenshot. "You somehow got it in your mind that this person needed help. You risked yourself to save him and became some sort of hero. Is that right?" Izuku didn't think he had to answer. Hisashi's face twitched. "I said, is that right?" He watched Izuku jump at the tone and nod quickly. The man frowned and crossed his arms. "We've talked about this." Hisashi waved a hand in a vague gesture as he tried to word everything correctly. "This hero thing, haven't we?" Hisashi didn't wait for an answer this time. "I told you why you couldn't be a hero. Do you remember what I said?" I have connections to villains. The answer was unsure and a voice quiet. At least Hisashi seemed pleased with it. Because you're a killer, Izuku. A murderer. Heroes don't think murderers can become heroes. And they can't be. There wasn't an answer. What made you do this, You've never tried something as extreme as saving a kid. Excuse me? Hisashi has a dangerous tone, and Izuku shrunk back from his moment of courage. It was a kid. Probably my age. I couldn't let him get killed. A soft heart in your line of work will get you in trouble. If not the police, then with me. But you already know that, don't you? Izuku could see the building of a fire in the back of Hisashi's throat, added to the smoke that was building as the man stood up. You're lucky this time. My plan will go into action, and right now you're a valuable piece. Izuku stared up. Hisashi's throat was definitely starting to glow, and panic was slowly starting to set in at this. If finding someone with your analysis skill set was so easy, you'd be replaced in an instant. Though, the next time you try to play a good guy, we will find someone to replace you, and you will pay the consequences. We have no room for useless people. You know that, right? Hisashi raised an eyebrow, and Izuku cautiously nodded and said a soft, "Yes, sir." Another beat of silence was added before Izuku looked back at the table and continued with, "It won't happen again." So, I'll ask you this again. Given everything you are, do you really think you could be a hero? With a shake of Izuku's head, he said nearly automatically, "I don't." There was another smile, this one twisted. Smoke plumed out of Hisashi's mouth as he said a satisfied, "Good." There was a deep breath of air that caught Izuku's attention. Izuku looked up, as a bright flash of orange and red headed straight for his left side. All of it was worsened by Hisashi's bad mood. The Dire had lost all their bugs, but also started losing their moles, too. Their scouts are being spotted. Everything Hisashi needed for information gathering outside of Izuku was slowly crashing. It was only making him sour and impatient with everyone. Hisashi was right about one thing, however. Izuku didn't really have what it took to be a hero. Not if it meant getting Inko hurt. As much as he hated Hisashi and his orders, he at least loved her. If doing what Hisashi asked meant keeping her safe, he'd do it, even going through with this plan. Right, Hisashi's big Phase 1 he kept talking about. Izuku hated it. It sounded like a shitty movie plot that Hisashi could actually pull off. He had the resources. Phase 1 involved bombs, lots of them, everywhere, set to go off in some of Japan's biggest hotspots. 30 places in Tokyo itself, 20 in each area near bases. It was already set and ready to go. Hisashi just needed to get a few things prepared. Izuku was supposed to take out a political official during the whole thing, and Hisashi was going to launch a Phase 2 right after and take Japan by the reins. With how many people he had behind him, given the connections with the other groups, it was going to get a lot of people hurt. That didn't include the superhumans that he was trying to make, though Izuku didn't know if there was any others like Hisashi kept saying. There was more to this plan. It was stupid to think there wasn't. Stuff Hisashi didn't trust Izuku to hear. Big chunks and pieces missing. For all he knew, Hisashi had bigger things planned than blowing up public spaces and injuring hundreds of bystanders. The idea of that was terrifying in itself. However, Inko was supposed to be safe during all of this. Hisashi needed her to keep Izuku there. Without her life in Hisashi's hands, Izuku would leave in an instant. He'd never leave if she wasn't guaranteed to stay alive. Maybe Izuku could help her, though. There was hardly any chance of running into All Might again, to warn him, not like Hisashi would never find out. But on the other hand, there was Hirayama. He seemed like a sort of hero type, didn't he? That's what Izuku's been guessing at for a while now, right? At the thought of Hirayama, Izuku paused. A hero. A hero, that's it. Maybe he wasn't just a mole for the heroes, but he was a hero himself. He had the air, and that conversation at the stakeout was definitely something villains shouldn't say. Which one would be, though? I mean, in the underground circuit, right? He hadn't added to that notebook in forever, so he could have forgotten some names. Izuku knew this would bother him until he checked, so he got up and went to his desk, flipping the lamp on and bringing light into the room. He turned to his bookshelf and picked the gray notebook up from the neat line of others and set it on the desk. Hirayama has an erasing quirk. Those aren't very common. What else does he have? He has that weird sash thing. He hides his eyes, so I can't really tell how his quirk works in a fight. There's not much to go on. Shit. Think. Izuku flipped through pages, getting a cursory glance at names and quirks until he stopped at Eraserhead. He read this page completely. Hero name, Eraserhead. Real name, blank. Quirk, Erasure. Hair, black. Eyes, unknown. Spouse, not applicable. Current family, not applicable. Current occupation, UA teacher, underground pro hero. Fighting style, constantly moving, best at quick stealth fights. Hirayama's better at stealth missions too. Maybe that's something. Notes. Hair floats when quirk is activated. Scarf is primary attack weapon. Material, ? Avoid contact with weapon. Possible time limit on quirk use. Needs further analysis. That's it? That was all Izuku had written down? There wasn't much on the hero to go on in the first place, so he shouldn't be surprised. Videos weren't all that common, and he stayed out of the media as much as possible, so it was no wonder that Izuku kept forgetting about him. Still, it was something, or at least it looked like something. Eraserhead was the teacher, and Hirayama definitely had that attitude to him, too. And their fighting styles were probably similar. Then there was the scarf and the sash, hair dye for the different color, and maybe eye contacts? Who knew about that one? But, yeah, maybe this was solid after all. Doubt then started to rear its head in the back of Izuku's mind. What if this was just a chaotic theory he was making up because he hadn't properly slept in? He lost count of how long ago it was. Or maybe Izuku was so desperate for a way to get out that he'd protect it all on Hirayama. Now Izuku was thinking about it. It sounded kind of ridiculous. A hero in a villain group? There were plenty of rogue heroes and hero-in-training dropouts here, switching sides for their own reasons, most trying to fight a system balanced by too many rules in a public eye. But they all had a cocky air to them and made their past history and power vocal to anyone who'd listen. Hirayama didn't have that. It could be because Hirayama might actually give a shit about Izuku's well-being and listen, nay, encourage him to speak, which was surprising on its own. Talking to Izuku about heroes and not getting angry or annoyed at the fact that he likes him. He didn't go to Hisashi with the notebook after Izuku left. Hisashi would have brought that up immediately if he found out. And the conversation at the stakeout. Think about being a hero? What kind of villain encouraged another villain to be a hero? It didn't make sense. He thought about all of this before, and he already had his theory. This just made it stronger. So the guy could be a mole. Maybe the guy was Eraserhead, a hero. Maybe he was somehow gathering all the information he heard and sending it to other heroes or the police. It'd explain why things were crashing around Hisashi's ears. With enough time, the whole operation could be found out, bases and all. If he wasn't, then Izuku would just accept that he was blindly following a dead-end daydream. If he was, then maybe Izuku could get him to help take out the Dire, save everyone in the holding block from the tech team, and protect his mom in the fallout. Either way, Izuku felt sort of, dare he say, comfort at all of this. If he befriended at least one person in this shit-show of a place, at least he befriended the one person who he could trust. Hosu was a really nice city in Izuku's mind. It didn't have a strong Dire presence in it, and he didn't get to travel around all that much, but he sadly wasn't here for sightseeing. He was here to take out a target. Hisashi entrusted Hirayama to help, someone who had a reputation for getting assassinations done, and someone who was good at sneaking in and stealing things. Couldn't be a better pair to do a job like this. Izuku killed the target, Hirayama steal the note that Hisashi needed. Easy as anything. At least that was what Hirayama was supposed to think. In reality, it was a simple assessment. It was a real job, yeah. Izuku was supposed to kill a guy, and Hirayama was supposed to steal, but it was Hirayama's job to see if he was up to stealing and assassination for Hisashi. Have the stomach for actual conflict and blood, and not just a simple hit and run. Izuku really didn't want to put Hirayama through this, not if he was really a hero, or in general. He didn't like killing, and he didn't want Hirayama to see him kill anyone. But Hisashi was never a force to fight with. So now the two stood at the edge of a building looking down at the darkened window of the target's apartment. Izuku had his full mask and backpack on. Getting back up here would be easy for him, but he didn't know about Hirayama. It was a safe bet that it wouldn't be a smooth trip if both of them had to leave in a hurry. So the target is an informant to a local hero agency looking into crime rings, drugs, weapons, circulation, things like that. He ratted out a small black market gun trade, and some of Hisashi's contacts got killed in a shootout 2 days ago. One of them was supposed to get back to him in contact with some of the negotiators for the Yakuza. I thought the Yakuza disbanded after All Might became the symbol of peace. Hirayama raised an eyebrow, and Izuku shook his head. They did, but this one is kind of new and not very popular in big circles. It popped up in the villain underground about half a year ago. I don't know their motives, but Hisashi was interested in whatever they were developing and got some samples. Something about quirks. But the connecting contact is dead, and Hisashi can't find another one for a while, so Hisashi wants this guy dead, like a revenge killing. So the plan is we break in, you get whatever information he has, and I'll get the target. Hirayama didn't look Izuku's way, and Izuku only gave him a cursory glance before looking back at the window. They were waiting for the guy to get home from work, which was around 8. It was 8:09, and Izuku didn't want this to take forever. As much as he liked being outside, the longer he kept his successful mission report from Hisashi, the more irritable he was. There was a light that filled the apartment as the front door opened and closed. Izuku waited until the kitchen light flipped on before he used his quirk to leap off the roof and silently land on the fire escape. Sliding down one set of stairs until he reached the point of their entry, a window in the living room. He was just sliding the pane open as Hirayama had landed on the roof of the building and made his way down the fire escape. Izuku slipped in, kept low to the ground, moving slowly but as quietly as possible, to the empty kitchen doorway, the only source of light in the room. He glanced back to see Hirayama sneak inside. Though they both hid their eyes, Izuku was sure that they made eye contact. They nodded at each other, and Hirayama snuck in the office. Izuku turned his attention back towards the kitchen as he heard footsteps walking around. He pulled his blade from the sheath and slowly stood up. The target was near the fridge, if Izuku's guess was right. Footsteps moved, and there was water running and a clicking noise. The stove was on, probably making tea or dinner, who the fuck knew. Izuku just knew this guy wasn't allowed to enjoy it. Before he could take a step into the kitchen, there was a thunderous noise, and something whizzed right past Izuku's face and embedded itself into the wall directly across from the doorway. Gunshot. Izuku was frozen for all but a minute before he leaned back and kneeled back down again. Hand now holding tighter to the blade and putting his free left hand flat onto the ground to steady himself. The weight hurt slightly, but that didn't matter right now. What mattered was that he almost got shot in the head. His heart pounded loud enough that he was sure everyone in the apartment could hear. He didn't even think that this guy would carry a gun in his own home, especially only a few days after pissing off one of the biggest villains in the criminal underground. He hoped Hirayama wasn't going to come running and give away that they were actually there. Right now it seemed like it was all speculation and the guy's paranoia was getting the better of him. Though no one hit the ground, so maybe Hirayama knew not to come running just yet. Or the rooms were soundproof. This guy seemed like the type soundproof. There were more footsteps, cautious, slowly nearing ones. Izuku tensed and was ready to jump up at whoever was going to show their face. A figure appeared in the doorway, and Izuku didn't think twice about jumping it, landing hard on his left shoulder and rolling off whatever the fuck he just tackled because that did not feel like a human person. It only took a second for him to realize it was a dummy. A dummy. Izuku quickly got to his feet as he heard shouting, spotting someone in the doorway. A hero. Why in hell the actual fuck was there a hero in the target's apartment? However, on the bright side, it was the target in the background holding a pistol in both of his shaking hands, face pale and obvious terror in his eyes. So Izuku scared him. At least he could do that. Then again, Izuku should have known. This was so painfully a setup, a basic setup, too. The target was a hero informant who pissed off the wrong people. Of course he'd be expecting some attempt on his life following the incident. Izuku went to let out a sharp whistle to warn Hirayama, but the office door opened instead. Hirayama was walked out by a hero behind him, hands up and some kind of quirk acting like a threat to his back. There was no way for Hirayama to reach his sash and attack fast enough without leaving a wide window for the hero behind him. Hirayama's bag being held by the straps in one of the hero's hands. Speaking of windows, their escape point was still open, letting in the cold night air. It was the perfect escape route as well. "Hands up, Rabbit. You're caught." Izuku held up his hands. They were opened, and his knife was balancing between his thumb and index finger. He saw the hero manual walking closer, most likely to restrain him. He scanned the environment to spot a vase of dead flowers on the coffee table. There was still plenty of water inside to work with. It could easily be a distraction. Manuel had a water quirk, so it wasn't like he could see it as an attack. Another glance around showed the stove was still on. A gas stove. Fire. Izuku had rocks in his pocket. Maybe he could do some sort of damage if he was quick enough. Manuel was now too close for Izuku to not act, and although his plan was stupid and hurried, it was better to try than to not. Hisashi would be pissed if Izuku simply rolled over and let himself get captured instead of fighting, not even including what he'd do to Inko if Izuku wasn't there to follow orders. Izuku closed his hand, and the water from the vase shot up and aimed for the back of Manuel's head, dragging the flowers with it. Izuku swept his legs out and knocked Manuel off his feet, bringing his foot down on the hero's chest once he was on the ground. Hirayama took this as a good chance to give a sharp whistle, escape, and bring his elbow into Manuel's sidekick's face. Taking steps back and twisting to deliver a kick to the guy's side and pick his back up off the hero while he was down. While that happened, Izuku opened his hand and the fire on the stove grew higher. The target startled backwards and looked at the fire, much like the one of the two sidekicks in the kitchen. It was the perfect chance to escape. Hirayama and Izuku shared a nod, and the older went for the window. But Izuku went for the kitchen instead. There was an insanely high chance he'd come out of this hurt if he went after the target, and it was better of a risk than not going for it. He had to at least injure and put the fear of the dire into the man before he left this job unfinished. Izuku was in absolutely no place to afford messing up, even if it wasn't his fault the target got smart. Izuku grabbed a rock from his pocket and chucked it towards the target, sharpening it midair, aiming for his heart. The sidekick closest to him grabbed it midair. Holy fuck, that was so cool. At the same time, the target fired his gun again. Izuku barely scraped past the bullet, and he could feel it nick his shoulder just as he went for one of the smoke bombs. Adrenaline rushing through his veins and pushing him forward. He threw 3 at the ground once the 2 sidekicks were holding in on him, and he jumped onto the counter. Smoke filled the room, but he knew where the target was. Knife in one hand and 2 small rocks in the other, Izuku jumped him. As the target fell back, the gun was dropped. Izuku took less than a minute to stab a hole into the target's chest and stuff the rocks inside once the knife was gone. He was thankful his own smoke slipped through his mask and he didn't see the rocks expand and take shape into awkward angling spikes. The target screamed and it turned into a gasping gurgle. Izuku had his hand around the rocks and tore them out only to chuck them in the direction of another sidekick, or at least where Izuku thought they were. His shoulder hurt, and it hurt even more as a leg came through the smoke and kicked him. Knife leaving his hand, Izuku landed hard on his right side and scrambled trying to find the missing knife. His hand closed around the handle and he swung backwards while twisting to fall on his back, the knife stabbing into the leg of whoever was approaching from behind. There was shouting as Izuku pulled the knife out and kicked upwards, foot colliding with the stomach and pushing the injured hero back. There was no time to make sure the target was dead. He hurried to his feet, using the counter as support, and stuffed the knife back in its sheath. The other sidekick in the room tackled him from the side. Izuku's right hip landed hard on the edge of the counter, and he hissed when it did. His right hand rushed up to the attacker's chest in a fist, blasting him backward when Izuku pushed the air between them. That was when Izuku made quick work of the jump onto the center counter to throw everyone off and make for the kitchen window. Someone grabbed at his backpack, and Izuku was quick to twist and kick the attacker. Toe hitting cheek, someone yelped. Izuku abandoned the kitchen window and went to the point of entry instead. He jumped for the doorway and ended up tackling someone in the process. Without checking which hero it was, probably the one who had Hirayama, he drove his elbow into the attacker's cheek and went out the window. Already seeing Hirayama in the other building looking back, probably wondering where the hell Izuku went instead of following him like he was supposed to. Izuku was quick to jump off the railing at the fire escape and use the air around him to boost into the other roof, landing next to Hirayama and pausing for only a second to land before taking off in a run straight ahead. Hirayama got the picture and followed. "That was stupid," Hirayama hissed as they ran. Izuku's answer was muffled by the mask and followed by gray smoke, but they were heard well enough. "Save the lectures when we aren't being chased by heroes." They hopped 3 buildings before Izuku was kicked in the side by an unseen attacker. He was thrown, quite fast, to the left, soaring over the side of the building and almost to the other side of the street, the disadvantages of being way too light on purpose. Izuku barely managed to twist the air around him to ricochet off a building, causing a small divot where the pressurized air had buffered the impact, and rocket back at the attacker, digging his right shoulder into the hero's side. Before he collided, he identified who it was. Ingenium. It explained how Izuku didn't see him before he was roundhouse kicked off a roof. But they couldn't catch a fucking break tonight, now could they? Izuku jumped back to Hirayama's side before Ingenium could recover from the attack. He was breathing heavy, the smoke puffing out of his mask with each exhale. Izuku couldn't pinpoint the source of his panic. Was it his injuries? The uncertainty of the target's condition? Hisashi's pressure on both of them to perform well? Hirayama tapped Izuku's shoulder and mouthed, "Breathe," before taking a few steps to put himself between Izuku and Ingenium, his free hand holding a fistful of his sash at a waist height, ready to use if needed. His jaw was set, and Hirayama seemed to drag Izuku from the fight as soon as possible. "We aren't here to hurt either of you. Tell that to the bruise on my side. Just turn yourselves in and there won't be any trouble," Ingenium said, voice loud and commanding. Izuku could tell. It was a determined expression behind his helmet. Izuku's nonverbal answer to the hero was to take his knife and hold it defensively. Hirayama only just held the sash tighter and only a bit more to make his threat seen. Ingenium audibly sighed and took position to take off at a run. Head to a safe place. We can meet back at the base. Hirayama was making his voice sound deeper and quieter. Why? It didn't do a lot to hide his voice. Izuku frowned, realized Hirayama couldn't see, and then shook his head. This was his job, too. He'd be damned if he ran away from it by himself and left someone else to take care of it. Izuku felt Hirayama send him a sharp look in his direction, and Ingenium took off and charged right for Izuku. Izuku jumped to the left and Hirayama to the right, landing on his feet and taking the rest of his sash in the other hand. The material seemed to float and obey when he sent it out to twist around the hero's leg. A quick pull had Ingenium's balance thrown off and him on the ground. Izuku looked back at the apartment building when he saw a flash of color, spotting Manuel with an almost livid expression. Well, Izuku thought it was livid. It was hard to see this late, and poor lighting, and so far away, though there was more red in his costume than before. "Rabbit, since you're not leaving, any ideas?" Hirayama growled as Ingenium was getting up, weapon ready for another attack. The hero's head whipped to look directly at Hirayama as Izuku pulled out 4 smoke bombs and a single small flash bomb from his bag, letting Hirayama get a glimpse of it before he did anything. Ingenium was cut off, from whatever it was he was going to say, by a flash of light and the mound of smoke that was swirled around in the air by Izuku's twist of his hair. Izuku quickly raced forward, grabbed Hirayama's wrist, and bolted the same direction that they were going earlier, reaching the end of the building and dragging Hirayama down into the alley, buffering both of their landings and continuing to run through the different streets, turning and running straight into a busier, bigger part of the street, a large courtyard between a few commercial buildings. Izuku made the stupid mistake of thinking that they'd lost any heroes, especially when he was wearing his mask and had no shortage of blood on his sleeves from the target. It was a method Izuku wished to forget, but probably never would. Hirayama took his wrist back, and used that hand to yank Izuku backwards and away from something landing straight in his path. It looked like a rock, or maybe something else. He didn't know. Citizens heard the loud impact and immediately started to panic and run for cover. Izuku hissed curse words and looked around. "Hirayama," he said while still trying to find a source of the projectile. "We need to get out of here before the newscasters get here." There was a silent nod before another person rocketed towards them. This time they both had a chance to dodge. Izuku wasn't so lucky to get hit with a loud burst of noise that was knocking him over. "They got everyone for us, didn't they?" Hirayama stated, looking directly at Present Mike. Izuku gave him a wry form of smile. He was glad no one could see the pure worry on his face and only saw the smoke that was puffing out of his mask. "Last time I fought Present Mike, Hisashi upped my workload, so can we bail?" Izuku hoped that Hirayama had heard him, or at least looked his way, but there was an indifference, and he didn't know if they were on the same page. Izuku had to turn his attention away from coaxing Hirayama into leaving, and on the hero they avoided heading for him again. Ingenium practically kicked Izuku back like he was a football, and turned to attack Hirayama next in an uncharacteristic close combat fight. Izuku hit the ground, bounced once, and rolled. The glass over his right eye was scratched, and the bottom half of his mask felt loose on the left. There was no time to assess anything more than that. He was barely up and running to avoid the next attack by Present Mike, another scream that was amplified through his costume and further rattled his bones. Izuku planted one foot on the ground and brought his hands together, pointed his finger gun in Mike's direction, and pretended to fire as Mike was getting back in his breath for another attack. The hero flew back as Izuku attempted to run for Hirayama, not caring to look at how the hero had landed. There was another kick and Izuku was on the ground, arched awkwardly over his clothes-filled backpack. Manuel, how the fuck did these heroes get here so quickly, was standing with his foot on Izuku's chest, both breathing heavy. "You need to," Manuel huffed. "Own up to your crimes, Rabbit." Izuku held Manuel's ankle with one hand, dropped the other to lay flat on the ground beside him. Chunks of asphalt catapulted upwards around all of them on the battlefield as they had made contact. One piece knocked Manuel in the jaw, and same time one had hit his chest, knocking him back as Izuku let his ankle go. It really wasn't Manuel's day today. Izuku didn't want to kill anyone. If he wasn't told they had to die, he didn't want to be the cause. He was focusing on getting to Hirayama, get as many effective, not deadly shots in as he could, and get the fuck out of Hosu. He could face Hisashi later. Escape was what was mattering most right now. With another burst of air to his jump, Izuku was headed fast for Ingenium, hitting him square in the shoulders and using the hero as a springboard with his momentum. Hirayama wrapped his weapon at Ingenium's legs and yanked back, making the hero fall flat on his back. Again. Hirayama's head had turned towards the other heroes, and he managed to push Izuku and himself out of the way of another heavy projectile. "You need to answer for your crimes, Rabbit," Manuel had shouted from across the field. Izuku kept himself from saying anything witty in response. Instead, he hissed out more smoke. There was a flash from a window. Izuku glanced at it and saw cell phones. There were people in the buildings, watching the fight play its course. Who wouldn't? It was a heroes versus villains fight in Hosu late at night. Izuku's throat felt scratchy, and the smoke that puffed out was getting to be darker gray than before. He had to be careful. The last thing he needed was to spit fire and be out of commission mid-fight. Izuku took his lighter and flicked it in a warning, letting the small flames show. President Mike paused and looked at him and Hirayama. Mike had seen a small portion of Izuku's talent with the fire. It and air were the easiest to use in a quick fight to make an escape, and it's not like water was just lying around the city and destroying a road could lead to problems for everyone. Izuku was waiting for something to happen. The field was frozen and everyone was too. Were they waiting for something? Or was this hesitation? Izuku tried to catch Hirayama's attention by opening and closing his free hand, but he could tell if he had it or not. The tension wasn't sitting well in his chest. The icebreaker came in the form of a curse from Hirayama, another kick in Izuku's back, the lighter thrown from his hand and landed somewhere else completely. Again, he found himself laying on the ground, now somewhat uneven from his previous attack, and trying to get up. He had landed and slid on his left shoulder. It was aching, and he was thankful for the thick material in his jacket, or else it could have been worse. He didn't have time to check the blood darkening or the underside of his jacket. Something had to have torn skin or something. He saw a shadow before he saw the hero, and leapt out of the way before Ingenium was attempting to knock Izuku out of the fight. Others converged on keeping Hirayama at bay, but the man was jumping around, pausing quirks, and replacing them with well-placed attacks. He was knocked around too, Izuku noted. His goggles were cracked. Izuku's breath was going, and everything felt loud. There was nothing but the fighting heroes to make much noise, and some sound of the city in the distance. He couldn't keep up this dancing back and forth forever, especially not with Ingenium's stamina. It felt like the hero was holding back, too, but Izuku was not going to be one to complain about it. "Rabbit!" Hirayama shouted as one of his jumps landed a little closer to the kid. He sounded annoyed. Ingenium seemed to hesitate. "If we want to bail, we better do it now." Izuku stumbled back after a weaker kick to his stomach, so Ingenium was getting tired too. There was the sound of whirring, and Izuku looked up. Helicopter. News helicopter. No, not the news. Hisashi was going to flip out. Not as much as he would have if it was Izuku's fault, but this was going to suck either way. He was pretty sure dark smoke escaped his mouth along with a quiet "fuck" that almost sounded like a soft panic and defeat. It seemed to throw Ingenium off, and Izuku managed to get in a kick and pick up enough asphalt to rapid-fire the hero's chest and push him back. Izuku looked over to see President Mike and Manuel on the ground, Hirayama over them and looking over expectantly. Before he could answer, Ingenium landed a solid punch on Izuku's jaw. The bottom part of his mask loosened a bit too much and sat at his shoulders, hanging awkwardly with a broken piece. That was going to bruise. Part of his mask shifted upwards, and Izuku was blinded for a moment as the glass moved. He barely had time to pull it back down. Hirayama shouted something, but Izuku wasn't listening. He'd never lost part of his mask before. In his moment of distraction, Ingenium landed a kick to his right side. When he tried to lift it up more of the road, smoke, this time black, came out of his mouth instead of air. "Rabbit!" Hirayama shouted, but Izuku didn't know why he heard everything through cotton instead. He didn't really mean to do anything back after he had landed except run. But the next thing he knew, Ingenium was clutching his side and stumbling backwards. Izuku was fallen back and on the ground, chin feeling warm and someone pulling on his arm to get him to move. Aizawa led the way down the street, pulling an unresponsive Rabbit behind him. They made it closer to the train station when Aizawa pulled Rabbit out of the street and into the alley, keeping them both pressed against the wall for a few minutes before letting out a deep breath and putting the goggles on his head. Rabbit hesitantly pushed his mask up, the hood hanging awkwardly from his ears. Now they both had a moment to take in what happened. The kid was bruised to hell and back, plenty of scrapes on his knees, and he moved like his arm hurt worse than it did at the stakeout, so he had to have landed on it in the wrong way. The most notable thing was that the black smoke had turned gray. Hopefully that was good, and the blood dripped from his mouth, down his chin, which was not a good thing at all. He noted that the longer the fight went on, the longer Rabbit seemed to stress over not being able to get away, the darker it got. He'd seen it on the first chase, but now he'd seen the full extent of pushing the kid past that limit. Fire, shot in a bright burst that burned hot enough to burn through part of Tensei's armor. Aizawa would have to see if he was all right once the mission was over. What disturbed Aizawa was that the fire was a deep red color. In other words, it was a beautiful color, but it looked so wrong. and immediately after, blood started dripping from his mouth and his breathing was shaking. "Kid?" Aizawa started, putting hands on Rabbit's shoulders. Rabbit shook his head. I burned him. I didn't mean to burn him. I panicked. Rabbit's voice was scratchy, and he was still puffing out smoke. Aizawa shook his head. "Ingenium will be fine. Right now we need to get out of here and head back to the base." The change was quiet, and Rabbit pulled his hood up higher, and scarf more secure around his neck. The blood stopped and was only slightly smeared on his face. Aizawa adjusted his own jacket and his bag before starting the walk towards his train station. He didn't make a comment on how close Rabbit was sticking to his side. And when Rabbit had significantly more bruises, deeper injuries, and a decently hidden limp the next day, Aizawa had to boil his anger in silence. Important meetings were never really Izuku's favorite thing. He never liked them, and he hated standing to the side and watching people go back and forth. Yeah, he learned some things, but it's not like anyone expected a report on a would-be drug lord on their desks. So, no, Izuku was the backup in case someone had tried something, just so Hisashi didn't get his hands dirty if it came down to it. So standing off to the side watching one of Hisashi's meetings wasn't entirely unusual. He was meeting with Korra, the executive in charge of managing the information gathering and resources, who was standing between the two plastic chairs in Hisashi's office. She was a tall, intimidating woman, much like Yukio, except she had more emotion to her face. Her dark black hair was pulled into a ponytail and her eyes were in a light, almost yellow-brown. Instead of the white shirt, it was a deep red. The control of the shadows was her quirk, and it made sure to wield it in a terrifying way. The fact that she was here to discuss a problem had Izuku on edge. "We have a problem," Korra started, her tone suggesting she had a whole explanation prepared. Hisashi frowned and glanced at Izuku. "I'm well aware of it." Korra paused for a moment, like she was deleting her entire explanation and skipping to the end before continuing. "Due to recent events, I have reason to suspect that there could be a mole in the ranks," she said. "I suggest we take caution and look into newer recruits hired between November and January." Izuku's heart nearly stopped. If his own theory was correct, then Hirayama could be found out. The already dangerous game he was playing suddenly had its stakes raised higher, without him knowing. Hisashi leaned back in his chair and bridged his fingers, elbows planted on the arms of his chair. It was a long, quiet few minutes until Hisashi spoke again. "Agreed. Do what you must to find them out." Hisashi looked at Izuku with a mixture of expectant and curious in his eyes. "Izuku," the boy resisted the urge to jump at how flat his name was said. "Yes, sir." "I want you to try and figure out who this mole could be. Korra, I want a few of your agents on it as well. I trust both of you will follow through with your tasks." Korra gave a short bow and "You can trust me, Midoriya." Izuku did the same with a curt, "Yes, sir." "Korra, you're dismissed. Izuku, stay a moment." Korra gave another respectful bow before turning and leaving. Hisashi didn't speak until the door clicked shut. Izuku saw harsh eyes turned on him, and he felt himself starting to stand straighter than he already was. "See to it that this gets done quickly. I don't want a mole running around ruining everything before we even launch Phase 1. Do you understand me, Izuku?" "Yes, sir." "Yes, what?" "Yes, I understand." "Good." Hisashi moved to pick up his pen and continue with whatever papers were on his desk. "Now leave. We both have work to do." In the middle of another sleepless night, not uncommon in Aizawa's case, the teacher's mind was running. At first it was thinking of normal things. How small the bed was, how much Hisashi would complain about the mattress and the springs, or even the size of the twin. Too small. He thought about Shinso, or how he might have been doing while waiting for the UA entrance exam. Probably training. He thought about the cats, and how he would probably be covered in the 3 felines when he got home. Those were the peaceful thoughts. Then one loud snore from Crusher, and the buzz of a pager put Aizawa back in the dire base and into a thought train cycling through everything, taking these quiet and active hours to process everything he'd learned so far, and string it together the best he could without writing it down. Midori Hisashi was the boss of the whole operation. They had multiple bases, and the resources to put bugs and moles in hero agencies all over the country. From the way everyone had been acting recently, something big was planned too. Aizawa leaned to grab the pager off the table. He was up to go steal some documents on the other side of town. He sat up, stretched, inwardly cringed at the springs, and got up, continuing his thought process as he proceeded to get dressed and put his gear into his bag and quietly left the base. The 5th floor of the base was the most suspicious, the one Aizawa had never been to and had very little information on it. It had been Midoriya's office, the most executive rooms excluding rabbits, and executive facilities. Aizawa had a sinking feeling there was more to that floor than anyone let on. The technical team, as everyone called it, created weapons and had a whole fourth floor of the main base to operate. There was possibly a large holding block on that floor, too, one that Aizawa had to pull away from before he could get himself in trouble by investigating. Rabbit's room was suspiciously on that floor as well. The infamous assassin Rabbit was actually a teen, a kid who didn't know his exact age and who was trained to be a killer. If the assumed timeline was correct, he was given this job at 11 years old. Rabbit had dreams of being a hero. He still admired them, though probably not as much as before. He saved someone without being prompted, and was accordingly punished for it. Expressed unhappiness with his work and distaste for doing it. That fight in Hosu was an indication that he mostly wanted to avoid conflict, if not for his own morals, then to keep from Midoriya's set of rules. Whatever those were, if Rabbit's tone was read correctly, he wasn't here for a paycheck. Something made Aizawa doubt the kid got anything so trivial as cash for doing this in the first place, so his motivations had to be something more. Rabbit had a not-so-subtle fear of Midoriya Hisashi, and for good reason. He seemed to know the prices of angering him, like he'd seen it happen before and there wasn't a doubt he had. Aizawa wondered about the connection with the boss, what was going on. Knowing Rabbit's name would help in all this, but Rabbit definitely wasn't what Midoriya was trying to build him up as in the media. To the public eye, it was working, though. The kid was a stone-faced and quiet killer who planned his steps and always avoided capture. Even better, they didn't know he was a child. But in reality, Rabbit was not an assassin. Not a calculating, cold-hearted killer. He was something familiar and much more common. It took a while to place, but Aizawa had seen something like this in Hitoshi after adopting him. Right now, so many years later, Hitoshi was thriving. He wasn't as sociable as Hisashi, but not as reserved like Aizawa. He was comfortable in his skin, and, though it didn't exactly show, was somewhat comfortable and confident in his abilities. Though he'd most likely be fighting a rigged hero system, he was doing it anyways. He was normally tired and had bright eyes, except for the bags underneath. Yeah, he had problems, and nasty habits, that was a given, but before that? Before Aizawa and Hisashi adopted him, Hitoshi was a kid in a beat-down orphanage in one of the shittier parts of town, villainized and muzzled for his quirk, with dull and scared eyes, tired, fearful of the world and anyone who got close, thinking he wasn't going to be a hero, like he'd get hurt if he tried making attachments, like he already got hurt for making them. Rabbit had those eyes. There wasn't anything Aizawa hated seeing more than those fucking eyes. Staying up late to bring up the files was probably the easiest thing to do when researching new recruits. Hands down the easiest thing Izuku had done all week. It took 2 hours before he researched Hirayama Masato. Everything was there, though. A birth certificate, evidence he graduated from different schools, criminal record, time in jail, everything looked to be in place, except it wasn't. Digging deeper proved harder to do, but gave plenty of evidence. Hirayama's files in these so-called schools didn't exist. The prison had no record of having anyone by his name, no record of parents, family, work. There were last names like his, but they had wildly different stories. It wasn't likely that he was a runaway either, because that birth certificate lined up with exactly none of those families. It was like he appeared from mid-air. It proved he was under an alias. Any alias that complicated was meant to hide something. If Hirayama were found out, he wouldn't be spared. Just the opposite, actually. They'd find out who he really was and make him watch as they took everything away, before killing him. And it wouldn't be swift and painless either. That wasn't how Hisashi worked. If what Hirayama was saying was true, he had a family. The look in his eyes when he said he did was genuine. Izuku believed it. Maybe it was a brother or a kid. Whoever it was, Hisashi would kill them. No question, no hesitation. Age didn't matter in situations like that. Izuku leaned back in his chair, hand brushing his bangs back and sitting on top of his head. He was thinking about what to do. What could he do? He was trapped between a gun and a knife. The knife, turn Hirayama in and watch as someone who cared about him, who Izuku cared about, suffer and die, along with whoever he loved. The gun, keep this a secret and let Hisashi find out on his own that Izuku was keeping a mole from him, even feeding it, metaphorically anyways, which got them both killed, and his mother and Hirayama's family along with them. The thought of his mother made this harder. The thought of Hirayama's family made it harder. The knowledge that Hisashi would find either of these things out made it harder. What should he do? Save himself and his mother, or let Hisashi kill a hero and his family to contribute with his plan? Get all of them killed by not saying anything and let Japan go to shit? Or, Izuku glanced at the dresser and its hidden compartment underneath, Give the heroes what they're trying to find and then some. In that long run, a lot of people were saved. The only downside was that it got Izuku and Inko killed for his betrayal when he found out. He spent this long trying to protect her, putting off with the tech team and Hisashi, following every order as best he could, but the option that saved the most people would kill her. Izuku groaned and shut his laptop. He put his elbows on the desk and his forehead in his hands. Why did he have to go and get attached to someone? A soft heart would be the end of him. Hisashi had said that, and he couldn't have been more right. He'd think this over. Cora wouldn't be able to set aside one of the better hackers to this job for another day or two if she was currently trying to get information together for Phase 1. However, it launched in 3 days. He had no time to dawdle. Not too long. If he kept putting it off until it was too late, his choice would be made for him. Izuku's pager buzzed. It was a small mission to do, just taking out someone across town. It might have been fate. He had to do something, but he hated. At least it gave him a chance to get outside for a few hours and get some fresh air. Izuku got up and got ready to go. "We need to stop meeting like this," Rabbit's voice said casually, almost jokingly. Aizawa jumped. He was walking back to a train station from his mission. It was 2 a.m, and Rabbit had come from absolutely nowhere, completely throwing him off. "Jesus, kid, you scared me," Aizawa hissed, fixing his coat in his bag. Rabbit gave a short laugh and a smile. There was something sad behind it, that Aizawa was careful to not ask about yet. Rabbit had his backpack on his wrist, where the sleeve slid back and where the glove didn't reach, was a small stain of dried blood. Rabbit caught the stare, pulled his sleeve down to hide it better. "I just finished up work. Are you heading back too?" "Yeah," was the only answer Rabbit received. "Shouldn't you be in bed?" "Sleep is for people who don't have a job to do." There really wasn't a way to answer that without giving a lecture on the importance of getting sleep, and almost hypocritical one, considering how much Aizawa didn't sleep. He decided not to answer and just switched topics. "Hey, about what happened in Hosu," Rabbit started. Aizawa shook his head to stop him from continuing. "It was rotten luck, and I should have listened and got you out of there sooner instead of staying for a fight. Did Midoriya do anything for it?" Rabbit rubbed his shoulder. "Roughed me up a bit and busted my leg. Healing quirk did some to help so I can walk, but they never really completed the job. They never do. Yukio, I don't think she was in the mood to do anything worse than that. I'm fine, though. It's all right." Aizawa hates how casually that was said. "Don't you think it's bad for an employer to threaten you like that? It was a setup." "I should have known better. It's my job," Rabbit said almost pointedly. "It was my mistake, and I paid for it." It was quiet between them until they were in a train car heading back to their part of town. This one basically empty aside from the guy with his headphones in on the other side. Aizawa could already hear his music from his seat. "Hey, Hirayama." Aizawa looked over at the kid and almost tilted his head slightly in a question. Giving a vague hum to acknowledge him, Rabbit was sitting across the walkway and messing with his gloves, wringing his hands over and over again with a conflicting look on his face. He was fighting with something, and Aizawa didn't know what it could be. "You know about heroes, right?" Oh, was he trying to bring back the conversation from the stakeout? What, was it worrying him or something? Then again, it was unwarranted to ask a villain if he wanted to be a hero, especially after said villain got in trouble for saving a kid, an equally dangerous villain right before said conversation. "Yeah, my cousin was a hero." At least Aizawa thought that his cousin was a hero. He didn't know. He dropped contact with that side of the family a long time ago. "Why?" Rabbit shrugged and looked away. "Your cousin, if they knew that hundreds of people were in danger, and the only way to save them was to kill 3 people they loved and themselves, would they do it?" Aizawa raised his eyebrows. "Sounds like the trolley problem." Rabbit raised an eyebrow in question, and Aizawa let his teacher side mix with the random information he'd learned over the years and started explaining. "It's an ethics question. The teacher I knew talked about it. It goes like this. A trolley is going down the tracks. The brakes are cut, and it's heading towards 5 people on the rails." "Why were they on the rails?" Rabbit asked. "They could just move." "They're stuck." Rabbit's eyes flashed with something before he nodded, and Aizawa continued. "If these 5 people get hit by the trolley, they die. You have the power to switch the tracks the trolley is on, but if you switch the tracks, the trolley will hit 1 person and kill them. Do you flip it?" "I guess if it saves those 5, I can flip it." Rabbit had a conflicted expression, so Aizawa shifted slightly to explain more, this time using his hands in a vague gesture. "There's an alternate part of it. Imagine that the single person in the trolley is hitting is someone you love. Can you flip it?" I don't know. What about if you knew all 6 of the people? Could you make the choice? Probably not. Aizawa leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms again. There's many versions of it, but it's all about how you view it. It's all a sacrifice. There's no winner, Rabbit muttered, and Aizawa shrugged. If that's how you see it, a hero has to balance this problem a lot in tense situations, especially rescues. Your question asked if 3 kills would save hundreds. Using how you see the trolley problem, how do you think my cousin should handle it? Rabbit gave a nervous laugh and went to rub his hand over his face. He stopped before he could and just put his elbows on his knees and leaned forward. You sound like a teacher. This got Aizawa to smirk slightly. I get told that a lot. Something flashed in Rabbit's face about that. What's causing you to ask this anyways? It was this old news report I was watching. I was getting information on a rescue hero. 13 and this sort of thing popped up. Another hero came in and everyone got out alive, so 13 didn't make that choice, but I was wondering what the decision would have come to if that other hero didn't make it in time. Something about that didn't sound right. If you were a hero in that situation, what would you do? Rabbit opened and closed his mouth like he was trying to find his answer. It wasn't there, but something flashed in his eyes that made Aizawa worry. It was the look of a mind made up. Instead of answering, the kid jumped slightly, and he pulled out his pager from his pocket. Aizawa saw there wasn't any notifications on the screen. Yukio wants me to do an errand. Rabbit lied, glancing at a space above the door labeled with the next station. I gotta get off, next stop. Said stop was nearing, and Rabbit stood up, putting the pager back in his pocket. Aizawa wasn't going to stop him. How could he? Rabbit jolted again and tilted his head up slightly like he was remembering something. He turned to Aizawa as he held one of the handrails. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you something. Slipped my mind, but I think you should know. The train slid to a stop, and the doors opened. My name is Midori Izuku. After that, he left the train, the doors closed, and Aizawa was left in the train car alone. Even the music guy was gone, but Aizawa didn't care. He was more focused on what the kid had said, both because he finally learned what he wanted, but it made everything so much more complicated. He got a few obvious answers, but now there were many more questions. Fuck. All right, everyone, this concludes Chapter 6 of Research to Rescue. Chapter 7 will be next, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.